Hey guys, Adam here, Car Center of Excellence, the KCE, doing some suspension upgrades on my 2018 Golf Sportwagen. So about a year ago, I put H&R Sport Springs on the vehicle, which lowered it a little bit, gave it a little bit firmer ride, but I kept the stock dampers, which I think were fine, but I've decided to go ahead and throw on some of the ever popular Bilstein B8 dampers. And I've already done the rears, and I've got one of the fronts done, and I'm waiting on my son to get home, and we'll do the other front, and then I can do a driving impression video. But just some things to go over about this install. It's a pretty common one. A lot of people DIY. Just again, a little bit about my car. My car has 56,000 miles on it. 30,000 miles of that was on the lowering springs with the stock dampers. About a year on those. You can see over here, stock shock, stock strut. This was the mount, the bearing, and the bump stop. It's a new B8 strut. I went ahead and got new strut mounts and strut bearings. Just a few other things when you do this. I'm using what's called the modified 2x4 method. Some people will say this is a janky thing, but you know, look, it's DIY shade tree mechanic stuff, and that's what you get sometimes. Somebody figured this out. I think it works great. 2x4 I'm using is 20 inches long. It's a 1/2 inch hole you drill in it to mount it. The other things that's important is replace single-use hardware. So in the rear, that's going to be the two shock top or shock mount bolts. In the lower, shock mount bolt. On the front, that's going to be the strut knuckle pinch bolt, and then the three top bolts that hold the strut mount to the chassis. In terms of special tools, really beyond what you probably normally have in your garage, you're going to have a spring compressor. You're going to have a 14 mil triple square. You're going to have, this is really the important one. It's cheap. I don't know why people don't buy these. It's called a strut spreader. This is what opens up the knuckle and allows you to get it out. And the other component is you have to be able to get the nuts on and off the old struts onto the new units. And to do that, I bought these chromium vanadium, we'll call it Chinesium, at Harbor Freight, offset open-ended wrenches. And so some people use a socket that has a kind of a window cutout in the side, which is really the better option because that's going to allow you to use a torque wrench. I didn't. I think this works fine, but yes, I'm not exactly torquing it to spec. I'm just tightening it as tight as I can. Yeah, so just, you know, the install went pretty smooth so far. The rears, the only real hang up I got into was when you, removing it takes just a few minutes. You jack up the car and you take two top bolts off in the bottom and you just take it out. Putting it back in was a little more challenging because when you mount the shock in the lower control arm first, it doesn't line up at the top with the top, the shock mount. And so it takes a little bit of force to force it into position. I actually used a jack on the control arm, and my son and I were able to kind of manhandle it into position. It's just not quite as easy as maybe I thought. And really it's because you're fighting against this lower portion of the mount has a bushing in it. And that bushing has to be deflected a little bit to get it in position, and it just was kind of tough to do. The other thing was on the passenger side, there is, when you take off the fender liner to get to the upper shock mount, there is a part of the fuel system that you have to remove, and I actually used some wire and tied it out of the way. I actually broke a tab on the back of it. It's held on with a single 13 mil bolt. I just couldn't understand how it was attached, and of course I broke it. But anyway, just something to be aware of, not seen in the other DIYs, that you do have to contend with that. Up front, I was able to solo do the driver's side with the 2x4 method. It's actually really pretty simple. It wasn't overly complicated. I've never done it before, but I got it done. I don't know, it was a little over an hour for the one side, and maybe I spent an hour on the back. So a couple hours all the way around. I think if you be honest with yourself, it's a 3 or 4 hour job, taking breaks, having a beer, getting some tacos. One final comment I forgot in the other little sections of this video is, for whatever reason, the stock strut and shock top mount bolts are standard size. They are not metric, which is bizarre. And so my Chinesium offset wrenches didn't work, and I had to kind of I got them to work with a little bit of force and some impact from an impact wrench. But anyway, it's something to keep in mind that those are not metric. Now, the reason you use these is this. It's so you can, it's actually this side. So you can put this in here, hold the nut, and then you use a 7mm Allen wrench is what it goes in here. And that's how you get these tight. If you use the sockets, it's the same thing. It just has a cutout in the side for the Allen wrench and you can torque it. But anyway, something important to note, if I would have known that, I probably would have actually just sprung for the standard set of these. They're not very much money at Harbor Freight. It was like 18 bucks. But that actually, again, caused me a bit of a headache, is getting these two nuts off of the stock units so I could, for the shock, reuse the shock mount, which was fine to use, and for here to get the spring off. So that was, again, something that I didn't realize getting into this, and it actually was kind of a pain in the ass. Trying to force a standard on a metric doesn't always work, and you have to kind of force it at a special angle. But I got it to work, and that's something y'all should be aware of. All right, let's talk about some things you read online here about using stock shocks and struts with lowering springs and these mounts and these other things. So the first thing I want to say is, so when you go from the stock to the Bilstein, you don't need the bump stop anymore because, number one, it's an inverted design, so the bump stop is our internal, it's down here. So, and this wouldn't fit on here anyway, so take that out. You always hear to replace these, even with just a few thousand miles on them. They're fine. Like, these have 56,000 miles on them, and I could have reused them. They're perfectly fine. The bearing is nice and smooth. There's no damage to the mount. So in a way, I kind of wasted whatever these cost. But you're doing all this work, I can understand it. 3 years and 56,000 miles, it's probably a worthwhile. But when I had the springs put on, which I paid a shop to do, I actually just reuse these, and some people would say that's crazy. It's been fine. I've never had any noise coming from my mounts. Other thing to talk about here is, so your stockers are twin tube design and your Bilsteins are monotube design. We can see if we can't line these up to show you the lengths. Okay, so the B8 is exactly 1 inch shorter overall, top to bottom, than the stocker. Now, the reason it's shorter isn't because you're using springs with a higher rate, which seems to be the kind of prevailing notion. It's actually because when you use a lowering spring, the spring is shorter, and so to maintain preload on that spring so it doesn't wiggle or jerk around under cornering, you just shorten the shaft a little bit. So when I took the spring off of the stocker, I'm not going to say it was loose, but I probably could have done it without a spring compressor. That shows you that it's not really that preloaded. On here, I had to compress it substantially, so it has a lot more preload on the B8, which was the point of the shorter shaft. So remember, a B6 is the exact same damper, it's just an inch longer, and you could probably use it just fine on this. Based on the little bit of preload I had, I think it's probably fine, but the B8 is the one that you're supposed to use with lowering springs. Now, the other comment is, oh my God, using stock dampers and lowering springs ruins them in a month or whatever you'll hear, a couple thousand miles. Look, I put 30,000 miles on these. They ride the same today as they did a year ago. There's no real reason for that to happen. I mean, unless the oil physically leaks out, it's not blown. The other thing I've seen with people is, and I'm guilty of this too, and I had forgotten when I made a video a couple days ago for a Facebook group, was dual tube shocks and struts have to be mounted the correct way. You can't do it upside down because the way this works, there's gas in here. And so when you invert them to push them on the ground to prove to yourself that they were blown, well, the gas bubble goes to the top where the valve is, and they just compress very easily. And that's where I think a lot of this comes from, is people saying my shocks are blown. But if you turn it the right way, cycle it a few times, let the gas get to the top where it's supposed to be, and the valve down in the oil, it works just fine. All right, guys, so this is the stock strut, and this has had a lowering spring on it for 1 year and 30,000 miles. And as you can see, let me cycle it a few times because it's been laying on the table. Get the gas up to the top. It's not blown. It just probably feels like the day it was new, or damn close to it. You can see how nice and slow it rebounds. So these are still perfectly fine to use. They're not blown. But if I turn it upside down, which I think is what a lot of people do, including myself, let's cycle it. Okay, now the gas is going to be up top, and watch what happens. That's, I think, where people think they're blown. It still rebounds slow, but it doesn't compress very slowly. Okay, so here's the Bilstein, which is a monotube and a gas strut, and it doesn't matter. It can be inverted or normal position. And you can feel, or you can probably see, this definitely has a higher rate of damping. I don't know, 25%, 30% at most. Might be even a little less. It feels pretty close to what the stock did. Closing this out, I'm actually not going to make a video of us actually installing the front strut. There's lots of DIYs out there that show you the procedure for the 2x4 method. It works just fine. Again, I was able to do it solo in about an hour on one side. Be a little faster with the helper. Talked a little bit about the different aspects of the shocks and struts, the mounts, hardware, and the tools. Yeah, I'm looking forward to taking it for a drive. I mean, my overall impression of a year of driving with the H&R Sports on this Sportwagen has been that on the stock dampers, I think that compression damping is fine. It's extension damping or rebound damping that I think is lacking with the stock dampers on the slightly higher rate springs. So when you're driving along and you go through a shallow dip, on the stock dampers, it's kind of like this. And on the B8s, it should be like this. And that's really all I was after here, was a little bit better control at high speeds. I'm going to take the car to the track again this fall, and I'd just like to have the best performing suspension I can. Here's the front setup. So your strut, what you end up taking off is the sway bar, upper sway bar mount nut. This is the pinch bolt back here. You do have to move this ABS line out of the way to get your 2x4 in. And then, of course, up top, there's a clip on each side. You pull this up and you can access the top. So that's all the access points. The strut spreader tool goes basically back in this back part of the knuckle. There's a little spot actually for it. It slides in and you turn it and it opens it up.